So, what is international relations? And the other names for this field is world politics and global politics, but I think I like to keep it as international relations. The main difference between international relations and, say, world politics or global politics is that international implies kind of interstate or inter-nation state, whereas world politics and global politics brings in actors other than states. And today probably it is more accurate to call the field global politics because we are living in a global era of globalization. And there are more than just states that are driving international relations. We have multinational corporations, we have social movements, non-governmental organizations, international organizations. There's a lot more to international relations today than just states. This is why some scholars are not comfortable calling the field international relations, but they would like to call this field global politics or world politics. But on the other hand, this field has been known for so long as international relations that some of us like to prefer to keep it that way. And even though we understand that international relations is no longer about, or never probably was about, just states. And in fact, I like to call it global international relations. Instead of global politics or international relations, I like to call it global IR, global international relations. That way, we keep the original title of the field, or international relations, but we also bring in the global dimension. And looking at, therefore, the definitions of what is international relations, one of the traditional definitions that I provided from the American Heritage Dictionary is that international relations is the branch of political science that is concerned with foreign affairs of and relations among countries. Again, if you look at it carefully, it's mostly about, it says that it's a branch of political science, and that itself is questionable because international relations can also bring in economics, history, sociology, and even anthropology. So when you're looking at the past of some of the traditional societies where there are a lot of ethnic issues and ethnic conflicts. So it is also not very accurate to call international relations as a branch of political science anymore, even though traditionally that's what it has been. International law is another sort of source of international relations. International relations is really multidisciplinary, not just about political science. You therefore should keep that in mind, that the traditional idea that international relations is a branch of political science is not very accurate, at least no longer accurate. There are all kinds of people from various disciplines that study international relations. You can be studying science, physics. We have students and professors in my university who are scientists, and they become specialists in international relations because they can study the science of the relationship between science and technology and international relations. People who are economists, they study international relations like trade or finance or investment, and those are very key determinants of international relations today. Of course, history is extremely important. You cannot understand international relations without looking at history. And this is not just history of the post-Second World War period, but also history of the European state system and the colonization of the world and the like. But this is something that hasn't really got into the minds of a lot of scholars, and they still think of international relations as a branch of political science. The other aspect of this definition is it talks about relations among countries. True, but countries don't mean states. Countries here, if you think of international relations as just between states, that's a very narrow conception. So again, as I said earlier, you have to bring in non-state actors, including international organizations and civil society, non-governmental organizations and corporations and the like. So the new definition I suggested from my own is that the study international relations or world politics or global politics is the study of interactions among states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, and other non-state actors over a variety of issues: security, trade, development, finance, ecology, human rights, resources, migration, etc. And it is increasingly about managing transnational issues in an increasingly globalized world. So that may be a more accurate way of describing international relations and its definition, giving it a definition, than simply calling it as a branch of political science which looks at the relationship among states. So following on, the actors of international relations, again, not just states, but also multinational corporations, international organizations. So here multinational corporations would be like Coca-Cola, Toyota, Microsoft, Shell, Google. International organizations will be like UN, European Union, ASEAN. Transnational, non-governmental organizations and movements like the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, and the like. And the non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, pirates of the Somali coast, or pirates in the Straits of Malacca, for example, for that matter, groups engaged in money laundering and people smuggling. So a variety of actors, not just governments or big powers. And same with issue areas. International relations has it covers multiple issue areas. So initially, international relations was about diplomacy, war and peace. These remain important. We cannot say that diplomacy and war and peace have become insignificant. But there are a variety of new issues, other issues that have joined the agenda of international relations. Those will include things like humanitarian aid, humanitarian intervention, for example, helping earthquake victims in Haiti or flood victims in Pakistan, or in the case of Myanmar, we had the cyclone Nargis, which became 2008 very, very important factor in the international relations surrounding Myanmar of Southeast Asia. Climate change, environmental protection is another issue. Terrorism is another issue. Migration is important, very important issue. Migration could include forced migration, like refugees, or illegal migration, like people smuggling, and the like. And disease and pandemics are also very important. As in Southeast Asia, we learned during the 2003 crisis of SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, or the fear of a bird flu or swine flu. Those things are always in the minds of policymakers and people, not only in this region but around the world. So pandemics and disease are also very important to the study of international relations. Many of these so-called new issues, many of these transnational issues are, we call them transnational because they don't, they defy national boundaries or even regional boundaries. So in the traditional international relations, we used to think of relations among states, and states, as you know, are traditionally defined as political units which have sovereignty and territorial integrity. They're political units within a defined territory, and they're units that enjoy sovereignty. But transnational issues like climate change, like terrorism, like migration or pandemics, they don't really respect national boundaries. They can arise in one place, they travel very easily, spill over across borders, across regions, and become regional or global. And as globalization progresses, and globalization here means increase in transport, communication, technology, people flows, tourism, travel, and the like. As these things increase, even some domestic issues or local issues become global. And this is why international relations has to pay attention to that as well. And you cannot simply stick to studying foreign policy or diplomacy between states. And also, one of the things about these transnational issues is that no single country, no matter how powerful that country is, can manage it unilaterally. Because these issues travel across borders easily, it's very hard for one country to manage them, or even a bunch of countries to manage them. So the most powerful countries in the world, like the United States, the members of the European Union, or China, or Japan, or India, none of them can address or manage these issues like climate change, like pandemics, disease, or terrorism, just by themselves. They need international cooperation. They need support of other states. And this is another sort of a change from the traditional view of international relations. We have some issues that defy unilateral solution, and as these issues become more salient, there is a need, therefore, for new forms of global governance. Global governance here means that the attempt by the entire international community to manage common issues, transnational issues. And that idea of global governance also makes it sort of anachronistic to call our field international relations in the traditional sense. So keep those things in mind before we move to theory. And here, international relations theory is a way of understanding, making sense of the chaos of developments and the facts about international relations that you are bombarded with on a daily basis. It helps you to organize your thinking, find coherent explanations for why states behave in the way they do, why they make war and peace, how is cooperation organized to manage transnational issues, why terrorism occurs, how does the rise of China affect us, all these issues. Theory helps you to make sense of this variety of developments. Some of them are very conflicting, some of them are about, they speak to a pattern, but there is so much going on in the world that you need theory to make sense of this, and without theory, it will be very chaotic, very disorganized. Your explanation and understanding of issues will be very disorganized. And when you come to theory, I gave you a separate lecture on this, but let me just restate this very important metaphor that I use to explain international relations theory. The three main theories of international relations, main here meaning mainstream. These are the ones that are used by most scholars in most places around the world. And that's realism, liberalism, and constructivism. To understand realism, liberalism, and constructivism, I give you this idea or the metaphor of a my new neighbor dilemma. My new neighbor dilemma is a way to understand how international relations theory operates in the minds of people and minds of policymakers. And this metaphor is about what are the reactions, what are the responses, what are the feelings that are generated by a person when a new neighbor moves into his or her neighborhood. And most of us have this experience, and if you live in a neighborhood, when there's a new neighbor moving in, new person moving in, who was not living there before, so you would react to that new presence in different ways. And there are three ways in which most people react to a new neighbor. I call them fear, favor, and friendliness. And these correspond to realism, liberalism, and constructivism. You can see that I marked them in three different colors. Fear is dark or black, favor is red, and friendliness is in blue, a shade of blue. And maybe that's a good way to describe realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Now, fear is the emotion or the reaction of a person when confronted with a new neighbor. That person would, the first instinctive reaction would be anxiety. and fear. At least anxiety, if not outright fear. So if you are that person, your response would be, your first reaction would be, who is this new person? Or where is he from? What's his background? Does he have a criminal record? Is he a nice person or not a nice person? But your first reaction would be one of suspicion and anxiety. You do not assume friendliness there. You do not assume that things will be smooth in your relations with this new neighbor. You'll worry about the new neighbor's personality, behavior, and also whether the new neighbor will encroach into your property if your house is right next to his. So just like this, some states look at other states with fear, with anxiety, with suspicion, with a sense of competition, sense of uncertainty, and a sense of threat, like encroaching into your property. It's a sense of threat, or even you might say that person has a new neighbor, has a criminal record, might he do something to me? So that fear, anxiety, lack of trust, suspicion, and a sense of competition, sense of worry, that's basically that's the realist way of looking at the world. Realists are pessimists. They look at the world as kind of it's like a jungle out there, and they feel uncertainty and threat, and they do not trust others. Their main response is, and as you can do with the new neighbor, when a new neighbor moves in, you don't know much about this person, you may want to put up a security alarm. So put up your defenses around your house. Be watchful. Similarly, states look at other states with that kind of suspicion. They put up their defenses, they build their defenses, they build their military, and maybe build alliances. You report to the neighborhood watch group, and that's the way they would relate to the outside world. They don't think of cooperation and trust as a natural thing. Whereas the second way of reacting to a new neighbor, it will be what I call the favor factor, favor. And favor here is basically a way of describing that you look at your new neighbor from a very self-interested point of view. You don't necessarily fear or distrust your new neighbor, but your main concern is, what can I get out of this person? Is this person an important person, powerful or rich or politically well-connected? And can I get something, can I gain something out of him? So here you might see that how you can use your new neighbor. What are the benefits you can get out of him? Now this is consistent with liberalism. Now liberals put self-interest ahead of everything else. But their self-interest is not one of fear or threat, but the self-interest is motivated by a desire to get something out of it, out of gain. So your interest is not necessarily incompatible with the interest of the other side. You can find some common ground. So if you have a new neighbor who is influential or rich, you can try to develop relationships where you can get something out of him and he would get something out of you. But the idea here is utility, gain, not fear or anxiety or a sense of dread. So you don't necessarily boycott or isolate your new neighbor, but you interact with him and try to find out more information about your new neighbor, and then formulate your strategy. You make some calculations of loss and gain or cost and benefit of dealing with that person, and then you make your move. Now states do follow that from the liberal point of view. That's also how states react to or respond to or look at the outside world. States are always trying to maximize their gain, maximize their utility. But they're not doing that at the expense of others. Liberals believe that there is something called mutual gain or win-win, or harmony of interests. So your self-interest need not be incompatible with the interests of others. The idea is to find a common ground. And you can find that common ground through a variety of means. You can, for liberals, free trade is a way of finding common ground. If you trade with each other, then you can use your comparative advantage, or both sides wins. And you can also do this with international institutions. And you can also do this, the liberals also think that you can have a win-win situation. Maybe one side will gain a little more and the other side will gain a little less, but still both sides will gain. And that mutual gain is very important. It's very different from the realist world, where in a realist world, international relations is a zero-sum game. So your neighbor's win is your loss, and vice versa. The other side's win is your loss, and vice versa. Now for liberals, that's not necessarily the case. And you can do that through free trade, international institutions, and sharing. And also liberals also believe in shared democracy. Having a liberal democratic political system can reduce the chances of war and increase the chances of cooperation and peace. So here the new neighbor dilemma is resolved by making some calculations about cost and benefit. You keep your interest in mind. You don't forget about, you're not making any sacrifices. You're still keeping your self-interest at heart, but you're trying to find the common ground. And using international institutions and using free trade and other kinds of associations. That's the second sort of response to a new neighbor, which is consistent with liberalism. What about the third way of looking at a new neighbor, a third response to a new neighbor? That's what I call friendliness. And here, you go a step further from the favor or the liberal way of looking at your new neighbor. Here, you feel a sense of amity, friendliness, affection for a new person. Instead of feeling a sense of threat or feeling or having a sense that how I can exploit or take advantage or make gain out of your new neighbor, you simply feel good about having a new person. You welcome that person to your neighborhood, and you invite him and his family for dinner, and also you help him settle down. You socialize your new neighbor. You tell him about what is this neighborhood like, what are the good things about the neighborhood, what are the things to watch out for, and you can also provide him with not only information, but tell him what are the rules, and if you have like a neighborhood watch group, what are the rules of the neighborhood that your new neighbor must know. So make that new person, new neighbor comfortable, socialized. And that's constructivism. So the constructivist view of world politics is that when states look at other states, they don't necessarily look at them with fear or simply with calculations of cost and benefit. They also look at them as part of an effort to build a common understanding and a common identity. They feel a positive emotion towards a new neighbor, and they try to socialize the new neighbor. If they find something that's not very appealing, or you find that the new neighbor doesn't know much about the neighborhood, that might create problems between you and him, you try to socialize, you try to tell the new neighbor about what are the rules, what are the do's and don'ts of this neighborhood. And it helps the neighbor settle. So states do the same thing. They socialize each other, especially those are sort of relatively inexperienced in international relations. Those are like rising powers, like China, who are emerging from relative isolation to kind of a very globalized, interconnected world. So neighbors of China in that case will try to socialize China and tell the Chinese about the rules of the neighborhood. I mean, there's a good example would be ASEAN. When ASEAN looks at China, China was for a long time, rather relatively isolated, relatively hostile towards ASEAN. When China emerged from that in the 1990s, partly because of its economic reforms, ASEAN countries, instead of feeling threatened, especially at that time, or simply thinking about gain, they also welcome China, try to socialize China in the ASEAN way, the way ASEAN manages regional relations among in the region, or ASEAN countries manage relations among themselves. They try to teach the Chinese about the ASEAN way, and that's the good example of how the constructivists view a new neighbor, and how constructivists resolve the new neighbor dilemma. So it's also possible that you could have all the three feelings of fear, favor, and friendliness in different degrees. You may have one of the feelings in more to a greater extent than the others. And international relations, foreign policy is very complex. So most states will have an element of fear, element of favor, and element of friendliness. But usually they would have one of them to a greater degree than others. It's impossible to say that all the states in the world are driven by fear. Or it's impossible to say that all the states, or all the governments, all the actors in the world are driven by friendliness or by favor, a sense of gain. These things may exist in different degree, but you should look into these three different ways of responding to a new neighbor when you analyze international relations. And in a nutshell, therefore, these correspond to realism, liberalism, and constructivism.